Welcome all. If you don't know me, I'm the director of the Buffett Center. I'm Hendrik Spruit. Welcome all. It's always good to see a full room. Just a week ago we had Tariq Ramadan here with a standing audience, and now we're doing the same thing with David Harvey. So it's very nice to see all of you here again, and welcome. I'll just say a few quick words about David Harvey, although I think we all know who he is. He is, at this point, the distinguished professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Prior to that, he was at Johns Hopkins University. And before that, I believe the Harold Mackinder Professor of Geography, an aptly named chair, actually. He's the author of 16 to 17 books by my count, and far more articles than that. He works across the fields of anthropology, sociology, political science. In fact, truly a Renaissance man who can speak on many, many topics, and it's a true pleasure to have him here. He's going to speak about his latest book, The Enigma of Capital. I think we're going to go on for about 45 minutes and then open it up for Q&A. We will stop strictly sharply at 8:30 because there's another engagement shortly after this one. All right. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Harvey to Northwestern.
You know, one of the things I like to do when I write a book is to ask the question, what can I say about something or a situation that other people are not saying? And when I was invited to write this book by an old friend of mine who now works for a London publisher, I asked myself exactly that question. And actually it turns out it's not too hard to do that because A, I'm a Marxist and there aren't many of us around, and B, I'm a geographer, and actually as a Marxist and a geographer you sort of reduce the possible perspectives, rival perspectives, to a very, very narrow group of people. So I set out to do it that way, and the center of it was really crude in when I read the following incident, which I really liked a lot. When Her Majesty the Queen went to London School of Economics to open some building somewhere, she had a lunch afterwards, and she turned to the economists there and she said, "How come you guys didn't see this thing coming?" Well, she didn't say it that way because Her Majesty wouldn't say that. And the result was the economists, it was the kind of question I would like to ask of economists, but they'd never give me the time of day of giving me an answer. But, Her Majesty has a kind of sort of feudal residual power. and the economists of the British Academy decided to put together a whole group of people, and so they got about 20 or 30 of them, including the Governor of the Bank of England, to try and provide an answer to Her Majesty as to how come they had not seen the crisis coming. And the letter they wrote 6 months later was actually a bit astonishing. The gist of it was that they had all been working extremely hard on understanding various aspects of the system, and they had worked through very rigorously what had been happening. But the one thing they all seemed to have missed was systemic risk. Now to me, if you're doing with anything, I would have thought systemic risk would be the central thing you'd be concerned with. And the systemic risks of an economic system should be surely at the centerpiece of your concern. They then went on to kind of say, and of course we were all caught up in the politics of denial, which is a polite way of saying that they were all caught up in the euphoria of everything was going fine and lovely, and we were in the great moderation and all those other things. So I thought, well, I'd try and help them out with systemic risk, which, of course, in my language means the internal contradictions of capitalism. So I thought I'd write a little book to give them some instruction on how the internal contradictions of capitalism produce crises periodically, and what those crises might look like, and how going into them and coming out of them has a certain kind of dynamic. Now, it turns out that just recently the International Monetary Fund issued a big report on the question of systemic risk, and it said, well, the study of systemic risk is in its infancy, we have a lot of work to do, we're really beginning on it now. And then the former chief economist of the World Bank said, well, don't expect anything fast because, you know, this sort of thing takes an awful lot of time to work out. So I was very gratified when I actually got rather a nice review of The Enigma of Capital in the IMF House Journal. And I thought, well, actually I am going to save them a lot of time. And the guy kind of said, well, you know, the arguments here are rather interesting and we should pay attention to them. And it ended up saying the following: do I buy his argument? No, not yet. Would I buy this book? Definitely. And I thought, well, you know, that's a pretty good endorsement coming from the IMF. On the other hand, I also thought getting a good endorsement from the IMF suggests I've done something terribly wrong. And this was made even worse by the fact I got a not a bad review in the Financial Times. So I'm beginning to get seriously worried, but for various reasons, and I can understand this, I'm getting worse reviews from the Marxist left than I am getting them from organizations and institutions like that. And I think I'll try and explain a little bit why. Now, in setting this up, I wanted to try to look at a whole set of ideas, and one of the ideas which is central to the book is the idea of what you might call moving around, the moving around of the crisis. And there's moving around in a double sense. That is, a crisis which has a certain configuration at a certain historical moment gets resolved, but in being resolved it actually generates the next crisis, which has a different appearance. And so the relationships between the crises and the dynamics of the crises become very significant. The crisis also gets moved around geographically. And it's very interesting, in this country, of course, we're still sort of fussing a great deal with the nature of this crisis, but China, of course, has been growing at around 8 or 10%. Argentina is growing at 8%. In many parts of the world, people kind of say, well, there was a little bit of a problem, and then we went through it, and we're out of it, and we're on our way. And I think the centrality of the crisis here is best recorded in just a couple of, I think, very important facts. The first is that the IMF and the ILO produced a joint report the other day on the employment problem, and they said, well, in the advanced capitalist countries, the net job loss at this time is something like 15 million. 7 million of it in the United States, and another 3 million of it in Britain and Spain alone. So the unemployment situation is highly concentrated, and it's highly concentrated in the United States. The second thing is that if you look temporally, the last few recessions in the United States have been followed by what are called jobless recoveries. And this is very unusual. Usually when you come out of a recession, jobs sort of come back, but in 1991-92 they didn't come back very much at all, and they didn't come back after 2001-2002. And this time it's even worse, because it looks like not only are jobs not coming back, but even more jobs are being lost. So this suggests that the United States in particular is in a very parlous state right now, and therefore there is a geographical concentration of the problem here, which preoccupies us in ways which it doesn't preoccupy people in many other parts of the world. Any country that is heavily reorienting to the China trade these days is doing fine. Australia, for example, has been booming along, hardly felt the crisis because it's providing raw materials to China. Much of Latin America has come out of it by providing raw materials to China. I mean, some of the environmental consequences of turning most of Latin America into one sort of vast soybean plantation is really serious, but on the other hand, economically, they're coming out okay. So when I talk about the moving around, I think you sort of look at that. But then even geographically, when you look at the history of the crisis, you see that the epicenter of it was southwest of the United States, in the housing market there, and also in Florida and a little bit in Georgia. I mean, yeah, there's a foreclosure crisis everywhere, but actually those are the big centers of it. And those big centers are having very, very hard time recovering. I mean, sort of Nevada, Arizona, Southern California in particular. But it was this sort of geographical concentration of the subprime lending, reckless and predatory behaviors and all the rest of it, which actually then sort of got into the financial system and went viral inside of the financial system. But then the financial system sort of, when it went global, as it did after the Lehman collapse of September 2008, sent out kind of a whole bunch of kind of effects, varying a great deal from some German banks who'd been silly enough to invest in collateralized debt obligations and things of that sort, and you know, and municipalities in Norway or whoever had invested in it. If the banking system had not invested in it, the banking system was relatively untroubled. So that, for example, the Canadian banking industry has been relatively untroubled through this whole thing. The Indian banking industry has been relatively untroubled through this whole thing. And of course, India is also growing at around 6 or 7% right now. And East and Southeast Asia was not bothered by it. And here's an interesting kind of thing which kind of geographically looks very, very significant to me, which is that the crisis of 1997-98 was very much focused on East and Southeast Asia. Now that very nearly went global, very nearly. And it was just about stopped in South Korea by getting together of the US Treasury and the IMF and you know, World Bank and everybody, who kind of prevented that crisis going global. Now, the nature of that crisis was those countries were caught with very little reserves to deal with a speculative attack. And in effect, as they came out of the crisis, which they did by exporting to the United States, so they started to take measures to try to make sure they never got hit by a speculative attack like that again. Because in effect what happened is speculative money withdrew. It was a highly debt-leveraged economic situation in many of those countries like Thailand and Indonesia and all the rest of it. Industries couldn't roll over their debt and so went bankrupt. In came foreign capital, particularly from the US and Europe and Japan, bought up those industries, waited for 2 or 3 years for things to recover, then sold them back at an immense profit. In other words, people made a load of money out of the East and Southeast Asian crisis, and a lot of that money went to Wall Street, a lot of it went to Japan, and a lot of it went to Europe. Now this time around, however, they had the surpluses, and they deliberately cultivated the surpluses. So when the mess started, they were in a much better position to deal with this. So their response was simply, well, okay, we have the surpluses, we're not going to be hit this way. So they have come out of it fairly fast. And in some ways, you can almost view this crisis as payback time from East and Southeast Asia. I mean, I'm quite serious about this. I mean, it sort of has that flavor to it, that they're now in a position to come out of this and at the same time put the fires under the United States and keep the recession going here full blast. So that's what I mean about moving around. It's moving around geographically like that. And there's some curious incidents. I mean, I don't know what you feel, but as I live through this, I wonder where the next place is going to erupt. I mean, all of a sudden about this time last year, Dubai World went under. And I thought, well, you know, I didn't think the Gulf states were vulnerable. But they had to be bailed out by Abu Dhabi and all this kind of stuff. So suddenly then, and the next thing, suddenly Greece is in trouble. And suddenly Portugal and Spain and Ireland are all in trouble. And Ireland is an incredible state right now. And it's so interesting that 5 years ago, the main buyers of condominium spaces in Manhattan were Irish. They had so much surplus capital running around, they didn't know what to do with it. And everybody was joking, you know, they used to come as labourers and all this kind of thing, and navvies on the railroad and so on. And now they're coming in and they're condominium buyers. They're flipping condominiums in Manhattan. But now, of course, the Irish thing has gone bust. So I don't know. And it's just interesting to ask and think, where's the next explosion likely to be? And